Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the seminar to launch our annual Human Rights Report 2021-22 and the Human Rights Review of PSNI's use of force. It really is great to have so many people in the room and people joining us here online. Very, very welcome. I'm Deirdre Toner, Chair of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and after my introduction, the Board's independent Human Rights Advisor, John Wadham, will walk you through the reports, and then our panel will take questions. And we have joining us Deputy Chief Constable Mark Hamilton and Les Allenby. Today's annual Human Rights Report is the 15th published, and it provides an account of the performance of PSNI in meeting human rights responsibilities, as well as an overview of the monitoring work carried out during the year by the Board. In line with the Human Rights Monitoring Framework and Programme of Work, John has also undertaken a human rights review of PSNI's use of force, which is also being published today. Over the course of the last year, we've also published a detailed report on the use of spit and bite guards, a review of professional standards, and a report on the human rights of police officer and staff, which was the first of its kind by the Policing Board. And I want to say here on behalf of the Board that we very much recognise and appreciate the often difficult job that officers and staff within the PSNI do on our behalf in delivery of the service to the community. And attacks on our officers are completely unacceptable. We also know that having a rights-based approach to policing is an important element of securing and building public confidence in the PSNI, and we only have to look at policing across the world today to see that. It protects the rights of the public and police officers alike and provides a decision-making framework for officers to work within. The Board's work and oversight arrangements in respect of monitoring human rights has often been referenced and recognised nationally and internationally as a model of good practice. But it is an area of work that continues to evolve with policing change, societal change and new technology. Last week, in his speech at Queen's University, Keir Starmer talked about the importance of this work and his work as the first Human Rights Advisor to the Board, the importance of scrutiny for the accountability and transparency of policing, and of having a rights-based service so that communities can have faith and confidence in policing. Those principles haven't changed. John, as with his predecessors, have provided the Board with independence, advice and expertise on PSNI's compliance with human rights legislation through written reports and recommendations. He has unfettered access to all parts and people within the PSNI, which means that he can access and assess any information necessary to inform his advice to the Board. The Human Rights Annual Report 2021-22 contains 11 recommendations for PSNI in areas such as policy, biometric detention, stop and search, covert policing, vulnerable victims and treatment of suspects. It also revisits issues that were identified as part of the Board's report on the use of spit and bite guards. This year, John also makes 2 recommendations for the Board itself to progress in respect of the Board's oversight of custody visiting and the National Crime Agency. The Human Rights Review of the use of force contains 10 recommendations regarding the use of force, with a specific emphasis on the use of conducted energy devices. Further recommendations are made regarding treatment of people experiencing mental ill health and the use of body-worn video when interacting with a child or a young person. Both reports are an open and public commentary on police performance and how the Policing Board's monitoring work is carried out during the year. This element of the Policing Board's work is so important that it brings transparency to issues that infringe societal rights and assists public understanding of the implementation of human rights standards in police service delivery. It helps maintain public confidence in the PSNI, which is paramount in securing its legitimacy. As I said at the beginning, these principles lie at the heart of the work with the Policing Board, assisted by the Human Rights Advisor, carries out on behalf of everyone in our community. Over the last 20 years, PSNI have implemented over 250 recommendations made in previous annual reports relating to issues such as domestic abuse, hate crime, covert policing children and young people, public order, complaints and discipline, use of force, stop and search, and most recently the PSNI's permanent introduction of spit and bite guards. Having a positive human rights culture in our policing service and a willingness to be held to account to the community through the Policing Board is welcome. It is work that we are committed to, and with that, I'll hand you over to our Independent Human Rights Advisor, John Wadham. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Deirdre, and I'd like to thank all the hard work that my colleagues at the Policing Board, both the officials and the members of the board itself, have done in the work in preparation of these reports. So I'm going to start first with the annual report. There, you can see there an overview of the issues, but we'll move quickly as possible because I'd like to I'm sure we'd all like to ask questions, and I'd certainly like to answer a few. So we'll move on to the first recommendation. So one of the things that struck me when I first started here 3.5 years ago was that it seemed to be that the Policing Board seemed to be the repository of all human rights knowledge. And of course, that isn't true. There are significant members of the police, particularly at the senior level and amongst the lawyers, who actually understand a lot about how human rights is embedded and how human rights works for policing in Northern Ireland. And I can see some of those people in the audience. And so I would like them to do my homework for me. And I've been pushing them for 3.5 years to do that. And we are beginning to do that, move on in that process. So that's what the recommendation is about. It's about actually ensuring that everything that the PSNI does, particularly in relation to its transparency, its policies and its operations, are human rights compliant. And I would like to be able to sit at home not doing any further reports. So that's my plan, and I know that Mark and others agree with that. So this is to push them forward in terms of ensuring that human rights is truly embedded in everything they do, particularly, as I say, policies and assessments. In the second recommendation, there are some issues about compliance, some of them not the fault of PSNI, but more to do with the absence of legislation. So there are hundreds, possibly thousands of DNA biometric samples, fingerprints and photographs that are being held unlawfully. That's my view. Other people can argue about it. But it's clear that there have been judgments of the European Court of Human Rights about people who were not prosecuted or were acquitted, and that data remains on the database. In England and Wales, they fixed to a large extent those problems with legislation when the Conservative Party came in 2010. But they didn't fix that now. And that's partly because of a different jurisdiction. It's partly, I'm afraid to say, because of the absence of an assembly. So currently, we have the PSNI being forced to act unlawfully, and that's a shame. Now, I think there are ways in which they could do that better, and that's why this recommendation is being made. And I can talk in more detail about Article 64 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Order if people are as nerdy as I am about that. Okay, let's move on to recommend. So the third issue concerns the legacy bill, because the legacy bill suggests that they would keep all of these DNA data information on forever, or certainly until such time as the legacy body disappears. So there's a separate legal question. It obviously can't be resolved yet because that bill is still pending in the Westminster Parliament, and so that needs to be resolved. But we need to make sure that the PSNI, as far as possible, is following the law. So next recommendation. One of the things that has been raised by media in Northern Ireland themselves has been about how the PSNI deals with social media, not in the sense of responding to it if it's a criticism of PSNI, but to what extent are they mining that information to collect up data of people who they believe might be up to no good. Now, this is a recommendation to ask questions and to recommendations to ensure that the PSNI have a policy about how they are collecting this information, and particularly, are they using social media when they need to investigate individuals? a kind of separate question, because we know that, not surprisingly, like all organisations, PSNI will be monitoring the media, and I guess they're monitoring the tweets about our reports today, and that's absolutely fine. The question is, what are the controls and protections that exist if they are looking at your social media because they believe that you might be up to no good, and what are the rules and the regulations about that? Okay, so community background. So for many, many years, there has been issues about two-tier policing from both perspectives. And one of the problems has been is when we have seen some evidence of the difference between particularly the two communities of Northern Ireland, the evidence appears to be that about twice as many Catholic nationalists and Republicans are subject to stop and search, subject to arrest, subject to charge, subject to spit and bite guards, subject to strip searches of young people, twice as many as the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community. Now, members of the PSNI will say, okay, we don't know whether the figures that we collect for that are reliable or valid, and the extent to which those are flaky and problematic. So this is a question to move on from what we see in the public domain about these figures, move on to a process where we can get some details. So I've suggested that they have somebody outside of the policing board, outside of PSNI, to delve into that, to find out what the truth is, rather than we have a discussion of saying, oh, well, you're acting in a discriminatory way. Oh, no, we're not. And to move on to getting some of the facts in detail. Okay, in relation to recommendation 6, people will know probably about the search warrant that was applied for in relation to journalists some time ago and the problems that caused with searching their premises, etc. There have been other cases, and those are set out in the report, where there seems to be a difficulty of ensuring that when a police officer applies to a judge or a magistrate for a warrant, they ensure that all of the information, intelligence and evidence is provided to the magistrate before the magistrate makes a decision. The police have this strange, the police have a difficult job in going to apply for a magistrate because they have what lawyers would call a duty of candour. In other words, they have to go to the magistrate and say, we really, really need this warrant because this person's a bad person, or this house or this premises have illegal goods. But at the same time, that officer also has to say, but here's the reasons why you shouldn't be giving us a warrant. And that's a problem for anybody, and in particular for officers. And you'll see a more detailed description in the report itself, and recommendations that came out of what's called the Yurta operation, the journalists, made by Mark Hamilton to fix the problem. So what I'm asking for, what the policing board is asking for, is to report back on the consequences of those actions and to tell us what they've done to fix the problem so it doesn't occur again. Recommendation 7. Now, excuse me. The Justice and Security Act 2007 is in fact, generally speaking, a terrorism provision that used to be in the Terrorism Act, but was specifically designed for Northern Ireland. And when that part of the Terrorism Act was taken away some time ago, the government in Westminster thought that actually there should be some provisions kept. One of those provisions was a stop and search power. Stop and search power doesn't require individuals that the police identify it doesn't require police officers to have what's called reasonable suspicion before they stop and search someone. So in other words, they can stop and search somebody for no reason at all. I'm not suggesting that police officers do that, but one of the key tests in relation to stop and search and all police powers is you have to have some background of intelligence or information before you can trigger that power. And there's a lot of criticism in some communities about the use of that power, and the success rate, quote unquote, for that power is very problematic, something like 1%. So 1%, so 99 out of 100 people stopped and searched under that power, the police find nothing. Now, I don't know how many people work for businesses, but if you had a business where 99 out of 100 times you failed, you might think, well, is this a good way of running a business? Now, the PSNI, and maybe Mark might want to comment on it, do find some things, and of course, the things that they might be finding about, whether that's about munitions or firearms or wireless apparatus, which is all what the legislation sets out, are very problematic. They are about protecting people. This is a power, and because, as Deirdre said, because I've been vetted, I can go and look at the intelligence that is the basis of this 2-weekly authorization process. And I've looked at a sample of those, and I found, unfortunately, that some of those authorizations seem to be weekly based on weak intelligence. And that's something that I've talked to the PSNI about, and they have improved the process, and I'm going to go back and check on that in the next month or so. And I did see Marie Breen-Smith here, who is the independent reviewer of the Justice and Security Act, and she has some similar concerns. And so that's what, those are pretty nerdy comments. But if you look at the report itself, you'll see that actually I have some really more problematic concerns about whether the intelligence justifies the use of this particular power. And as I say in the report, this is 2007 legislation, and authorizations have been given both by the ACCs in the PSNI, but also, I should say, by the Secretary of State or the Minister in the Northern Ireland office. So there are some questions, I think, to be asked, because not only has it been authorized, it's been authorized for every single jurisdiction, every single district of Northern Ireland, every single 2 weeks since 2007. So some people might think that might be a problem, and I certainly do. Recommendation 8. So we have the legislation in relation to terrorism in arrest is the same in both jurisdictions, England and Wales, and in Northern Ireland. But significant numbers of people are arrested under the Terrorism Act here, whereas in England and Wales they will be arrested under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, even if they are alleged to be terrorists. And the problem with that is that you have, as a suspect, you have fewer rights under the terrorism legislation than you would have under PACE. And that's a problem, particularly in relation to bail, particularly in relation to people who are young people who are arrested, because it's much more problematic to get bail if you're arrested under the Terrorism Act, and you can be detained for much longer. And the success rate that Jonathan Hall, who's the independent reviewer of the terrorism legislation, has indicated in his last report, is very poor. So the success rate of arrest to conviction in Northern Ireland is 18%. Arrest to conviction in England and Wales is 50%. So Jonathan Hall and I both agree that the PSNI should be looking much more carefully about what power they use. Recommendation 9. We have a colleague here from the National Crime Agency. The Policing Board has a responsibility for holding the PSNI to account, but also the National Crime Agency in relation to its work in Northern Ireland. So I would like to, we're going to cooperate with the NCA to ensure that when they report to the Policing Board, they set out a bit more about the issues in relation to human rights. I'm not suggesting that there are problems, but I think it's the job of the Policing Board to investigate that. Recommendation 10. So, if you thought that stuff was nerdy, wait for this. So, covert human intelligence sources, or CHIS, or informers, as lots of people call them, have to be regulated. Any police force, any law enforcement agency in the UK has to go through a authorization process before they ask someone to be an undercover police officer, or undercover, or an informant, or collect up data on anyone else. Okay, so second part to the story is, are law enforcement agencies entitled to allow their CHIS to commit offences? Well, up until about a year ago, everybody assumed that they did, and they didn't have to go through any additional process. As a result of litigation, it's clear now that they do have to. There was a legislation went through the Westminster Parliament to have a process by which you can, the PSNI can authorise somebody to be a CHIS, but also authorise them to commit a criminal offence and give that person complete immunity from any prosecution in relation to that offence. So it's a very serious issue and a very serious power. And for those people who've been around in Northern Ireland longer than I have, you'll know that there are very significant rumours about the uses of informers and the extent to which they can commit offences. So this is a recommendation to do two things. One is to provide a report, and secondly, for me to be present when another regulator, the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, trips off the tongue very easily, comes to visit and inspect PSNI. More of that is in the report. Recommendation 11. This is an internal recommendation. For those that don't know, the Policing Board has a number of volunteer visitors who visit police stations and find out whether people are being treated properly. And we need to change some of the rules, particularly because of issues about confidentiality. I don't know whether you know, but police stations have CCTV that's recorded, and it's mainly for the protection of officers and others in custody. But our independent visitors need to be able to reassure the person that they talk to does so confidentially and can tell them anything, and the police are not listening. Okay, so then I think that is one report done. Okay, so I'll try and speed up if I can. So the next report, and perhaps it was a mistake to produce two reports at the same time, but moving on to the use of force. The first, that's a summary. There are 10 recommendations. The first recommendation, this seems to have got some interest in the media today. But I think it'd be good if people could look at the text that the Policing Board has agreed, which, and I'm sorry to read this out, but I think it's important. So what we are saying is the reduction in the security threat level in Northern Ireland and the fact that officers very rarely have to fire their firearms raises a question about what the criteria should be for issuing firearms to all officers, rather than, as in the rest of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, only those specially trained in their use. And the PSNI should consider this as part of its long-term plans. In the Republic of Ireland and in England and Wales, there are specialist teams that carry firearms. Because because they are specially trained, they can be trained more regularly, they can be trained to a higher level of competence, and it's much more difficult, and you can speak to any police officer who has to carry a firearm, that it's a big responsibility, and it's really a big responsibility to use it in a way that's safe. There will come a time, and people have said on the media today, they would like to live in a society where police officers weren't universally armed and carried firearms. I'm sure that will be true of everyone in this room. The question that the policing board is asking is, what's the criteria by which we might be able to move away from that? Is that going to be next year? Probably not. Is it going to be 10 years' time? Possibly. So the real reason, and I was happy to see a debate in the media, is what criteria should we use to make that decision, or what criteria should the PSNI use to make that decision? And obviously that's the debate that's happened today. Coming back to the, and that I should say overlaps with some of the issues we discuss in the report about tasers. But coming back to the rest of the report, and this is something that I've learned a lot in the last 3 years, when most of us see people being violent or threatening violence, we walk away. What we ask police officers to do is walk towards it. And they did that during COVID, and they obviously do that, and that's their job, and that's what we pay them for, but it's not easy to do. But it's equally very scary to be the subject of the use of force, any kind of force. And so this is a report to look at the details of what kinds of force the PSNI is entitled to use and what the consequences are of that. The two, I guess, key issues for us are what we would call de-escalation. Is do police officers have the training, the support, and the resources to try to calm the situation down? And I've watched a number of training exercises by PSNI, and it's a key part of what they do, but there is an argument about them being able to do more of that, because the more you de-escalate, the less likely it is that you will have to use force against a member of the public, but also, of course, the safer that you will be. The second issue, and this is particularly struck me and my colleagues that have watched, from the body-worn videos that we've watched where tasers are used and where spit and bite guards are used, the vast majority of people in those situations have very serious mental health problems. Now, there's a question for all of us, I think, about whether the police should be sent out again and again and again to deal with people who really have a mental health problem. They may also be violent. I'm not trying to excuse them, because they are the first and primary responders, and they have to deal with very violent, difficult people who aren't rational always, and people that they have to try to resolve the conflict to protect themselves, that individual, and of course, in some circumstances, other family members. Let's move on then to the second recommendation. So I should say with the second, third, and fourth recommendations, the question that we are asking is, do we know the consequences of the kinds of uses of force that the PSNI use, what the injuries are, whether the injuries are significant, and actually whether or not there's a learning exercise for the policing board, but also for the PSNI, about whether they can minimize the use of force but still protect themselves and others. Now, I haven't got many visual aids, but I've got one. This is a AEP. This is what used to be called a plastic bullet. This is what the PSNI occasionally use, and I should say it is occasionally, and I think there was only, it says in the details in the report, only very recently, but I'll pass that around. Some people may have already seen one of these before. So that's sent out a special gun, and it's sent out, and it hits you. I've fired one, as some of my colleagues have, and it's actually much more accurate than you would expect. And there are rules about where it's fired at, so it's fired out below here, so it doesn't hit your head. But if you look at the report that one of my colleagues did a lot of detailed work on the history of the use of AEPs and, of course, rubber bullets and plastic bullets in the past. So we're asking the PSNI to find out what the injuries are, and that applies to the next recommendation, which is about police dogs. Police dogs are used in a variety of different ways, which we set out in the report. Sometimes for crowd control, to ensure that that areas are protected, people don't go into areas which is going to be problematic. But sometimes they're used to subdue people, and obviously I would like to know exactly what the consequences of that are. And then the fourth recommendation, they've only used stun grenades once in the last few years. A stun grenade, you've probably seen the TV programs. Cops are outside the building, they throw this thing on, it goes bang, and lots of smoke, and everybody for a few seconds is disoriented. And then the police can come in and arrest people, and it's often used in hostage situations. It's only been used once, but again, it does have some effects on those people who are subject to it. And of course, it's often the case that when a stun grenade is used, the police don't always know who's in the room. So sometimes it's going to be bad people, and maybe we don't care much about them, and sometimes it's going to be people who are innocent of any crimes. Okay, so conducted energy devices. Everybody calls them tasers, but the firm that makes them doesn't like people using that word. So I'd just like, for the first time, to point you to page 40. I hope everybody's got a copy or access to a copy of the use of force report. In England and Wales, the situation is very different with the use of tasers. In Northern Ireland, tasers are only issued to a small group of highly trained officers, and in England and Wales, the process of rolling out tasers to many people, many police officers is considerable. And I think it's, sorry, I just find this page. Sorry, my file has fallen to pieces. Somebody, one of my colleagues could shout the number out. It's page 69, is it? There's it's a bar chart of that's, thank you very much. So here you'll see the explosion, if that's the right expression, in the use of tasers in England and Wales over time. Now what has happened is in England and Wales, tasers, these devices that give you a very significant shock, were rolled out as an alternative to the use of lethal force. And most people would say that's probably a good idea. But what happened is the more often you gave more police officers tasers, not surprisingly, the more often they use them. Not because they're bad people. If I was confronting a violent person and I could choose to grapple with them, or from 10 feet away fire a taser at them, I'd probably fire the taser at them. But of course, what that means is very significant numbers of people have been tasered. And being tasered, and there's a description of what it's like to be tasered in the report. So there's a question about how many officers should have tasers, and that obviously overlaps with the issue about firearms. And Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Service made recommendations that more officers in Northern Ireland should be issued with tasers. I think that will lead us to the same place as England and Wales, where more and more officers feel that they can only protect themselves with using tasers, and more people will be tasered. And if you go on YouTube and look at tasering, it's a very unpleasant situation, and significant numbers of people who aren't a threat have been tasered in England and Wales. So that's CDs. Let's move on. Next recommendation. So this is a particular point about making sure that taser use doesn't get expanded, particularly in relation to custody. And the next recommendation. This is, goes back to the point I made right at the beginning, which is there is a very significant issue for the PSNI about who they deal with and the extent to which they're doing policing as opposed to the jobs of other institutions in Northern Ireland, in particular in relation to mental health. And I'm not sure what the answer is, and it's not something that the policing board obviously has control over, because our job is to be concerned with the accountability of the PSNI and not all the other institutions. But there is, and I know that Mark and others have had conversations with the other institutions about what the effect of the mental health issues are. And lastly, no, sorry, not lastly, the recommendation 9 is about children. The children's charities and NGOs have been particularly concerned about the use of tasers on children and have suggested they should never be used on children. What this recommendation is about is to consider the best interests of the child, which is a United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child principle, and to see how this applies in the use of tasers. Some people say you should never use it. Police officers might well say there are young people under the age of 18 where they have to use that. That's a debate that I think we need to continue to have. And lastly, we're particularly concerned to ensure that body-worn video is used in all of these kinds of interactions. I and my colleagues have found it really useful to be able to not just pontificate about the theoretical process, but actually go and see the body-worn video and see how police officers, see the difficult job that police officers do, as well as raise questions about, did they shout a warning? Did they try their best to de-escalate? Police officers have a very difficult job, and that's not something that's easily to change, but in relation to these recommendations, I hope that they will improve the nature of the way that the PSNI does its work and affects the policies and training and processes. That's, I think, the end of my contribution. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for losing my place.
Thank you, John. If you want to take your seat. You're grand, no problem. Thank you very much. We're shortly going to take some questions from the floor and online. Just want to thank John for your comprehensive overview of the two reports. And now we're going to move questions with the Deputy Chief Constable, John and Les Allenbley, one of our most recently appointed independent members, whose expertise in human rights knowledge we hope to put to very good use. So I think you'll be gainfully employed as well. We'll be publishing this as a webinar, so those people who are online, if you don't want your name identified, if you want your organisation and your question, please put that forward and I'll distribute it among the in-room questions and online questions as well. But we're going to kick off, maybe go over yourself, Mark, thank you, and maybe ask you a question. These reports record a positive progress made across a range of areas, which I'm sure you know. But in my foreword to the Human Rights Annual Report, I wrote, and I note that the progress and implementation of some of these areas has slowed, to use a phrase. What's your response to that?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you for the report. And I think it's important for us to say as an organisation that the development of human rights in PSNI has been fundamental to our whole evolution over the last 20 years. And the challenge on human rights from the board continues to be vital to, in my view, the development of a community-based accountable police service. There's quite a bit of debate about this sometimes in policing circles. It's almost as if some people think that the police are almost as a battle around human rights, and it's absolutely not. The development of human rights-based policing following the Human Rights Act is probably one of the most effective tools provided to policing, and certainly the 28 years I've been doing it, and provides for us the codification, the processes, the justification supported by jurisprudence of the courts for what we do, which is really difficult. And what our officers do every day, Chair, is very difficult, very dangerous, often highly complex, and challenged, and quite rightly challenged in a democratic society. And I think that it's the Human Rights Act and the work around all of that gives us that framework for trying to keep the public safe and also keep our people safe, because there's human beings behind every uniform and behind every plainclothes officer and all the staff we have working with us as well. In terms of delay, I think there's been a number of factors the last couple of years. I want to reassure the public and yourselves it isn't because we're not interested. We've had the COVID factor like everybody else. We've had people working from home. We've had scaling back on things. We've also been dealing with a lot of recommendations falling out of other reports, particularly during the COVID period, into policing, protests, HMIC reports. So there's an energy and a constancy to the amount of recommendations that the police service is carrying at any one time. I'm not going to revisit the point that we're now a shrinking organisation. It's well ventilated at the minute, but we're less people to do all of these things. So I have recently run a ruler, so to speak, over the delayed recommendations. I've written to the board with updates on that. And I just want to reassure the board that we're committed to answering the recommendations. There's always going to be some that we don't always quite agree on, either in terms of their content or the timescales or some of the aspects of delivery. I think that's healthy as well. But we will also apply ourselves this year to this report and the two reports and recommendations that are in it.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to go across to other panel members. Les, your turn now. So you've joined the board in December, and very welcome. And you bring to the board immense expertise and knowledge, which is absolutely true. What is your overall assessment of how the police meet their human rights responsibility here?
Yeah, thanks, Deirdre. I suppose I've got a slightly less steep learning curve than some of the other new board members, because in my previous role at the Human Rights Commission, we would have had very significant engagement with PSNI at a senior level. I think one of the things I used to say in that role was that the only chief constables I'd ever heard that actually said the Human Rights Act was a positive tool for policing were Northern Ireland chief constables. And I know the current chief constable takes seriously human rights as well. And when I say a kind of a positive tool, what I mean by that, I think, is that you've got absolute rights and qualified rights. No one should be treated in an inhuman or degrading fashion, and that includes police officers. You've got qualified rights of the right to liberty and security, the right to family and private life, and that comes with a framework in human rights terms. Policies and operational decisions must be have a legitimate aim, meet a pressing social need, be no more than is required, be proportionate, and within a reasonable margin of discretion. Well, that's a pretty good framework, and it allows police officers then to say, I'm not acting on a whim, I'm acting within a legal framework. And I think PSNI is one of the places that gets that. Having said that, Mark has just said it, there are occasions, certainly in my Human Rights Commission role, where we disagreed with PSNI on things, but we always had a positive engagement. It was an informed discussion. And, for example, the Justice and Security Act and recording community background was one of the areas that, in my time with both Marie Breen-Smith and her predecessor, we took a very similar view about the need to record that, as just one example. So, in my new role, I know that the board will not be complacent about these issues, but there is a genuine engagement, which I think is positive.
Thanks very much, Les. I want to bring in Ali Kilpatrick. Is Ali in the room? Yes. Ali, how are you doing? How are you doing? I suppose we're delighted you're joining us here today. You're very, very welcome. And you were recently appointed Human Rights Commissioner, and of course, you're former Human Rights Advisor to the board as well. So you were at the Select Committee on the future plans of human rights legislation. So can I ask you for your comments if you have any question for any of the panel?
I'd be interested. Pardon me. I'd be interested to know, firstly, from Mark, if I may, what you think about the Bill of Rights bill and the impact it will have on operational capacity and also training, given that you have built on a framework of human rights under the Human Rights Act, and also to John, how that will affect the board's oversight of human rights compliance, given that the Bill of Rights is a very different beast if it is enacted.
Okay, so I'll try and stay out of the politics of this, if I may. I've said already, I mean, I feel that the Human Rights Act has been an enabler to policing, not a disabler, and we have our law, our policies, our procedures, our training, our ethos designed around compliance with human rights, but also not just the law of human rights, but the spirit of it, what it means for us as people who live in this community, all of us, and who work in this community. So that has taken effort, sweat, tears, argument over many years, and courage, a lot of courage by our police officers, you know, to take steps to support the notions of human rights and also to take risks themselves around how we do our business. That will take a long time to unpack if we have to repack it into something else, whatever a bill would be. I don't think I'm qualified to comment on the bill, and that would alarm me, I suppose, that we would have to try and do that. Our training environment is highly regulated. It's very expensive. It places enormous pressure on time, and it also then is highly reflective then of what we should be delivering. So anything that would change that would have to be very, very well thought out, very well planned. Would need to be as complementary as it could be to what we're currently doing, and would need to be able to support police officers in their decision making. And I suppose to finish on that, you know, all of these issues that are in these reports effectively come down to decision making, either by an individual officer or a member of staff, or by us as a senior command team in development of policy or giving direction and control to the organisation. And that decision making has been underpinned now for the last few decades by the European Convention on Human Rights. So to shift an organisation into anything different from that would have to hopefully be at least complementary, if not augmentary to that. And we would want to see that so that we could not have to sort of dramatically change how our police officers see the world. And I think our cops in Northern Ireland are very committed to policing their community in a way that's human rights compliant.
Okay, thank you. And I'll go back to John before I go back to Ali.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I'm old, and you can see that from my hair, but I've been in the game for a long time, and even like a couple of years after the Human Rights Act went through Parliament, people were saying, oh, we should be tinkering with this. That's in 1998, and I've seen suggestions made about why it needs to be changed. In practice, as Alison knows, that there was a 500-page review of the Human Rights Act produced about 6 months, a year ago or so, and what that clearly demonstrated was that actually even critics weren't able to point to many particular problems. Unfortunately, that's not the view of the current Secretary of State for Justice, and it's got a bill. But I find it incredibly difficult, and this picks up Mark's point, to understand what the consequences of that would be. I can see why it will have an effect in relation to individuals, but as a public authority, I think it's been much more difficult to understand what they should do or when they should do things. And for policing purposes, a lot of the cases that came out of the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights have been positive about policing and what the job of policing is really about. So I think it will be very confusing and very problematic should that Bill of Rights go forward. That's my personal view. The policing board doesn't have a view about the UK Bill of Rights. Obviously, we may have to have a view down the line where if the legislation continues through Parliament.
Just to give you the Human Rights Commission's view, it's that the Human Rights Act should be preserved and that it has done a great service to policing, and police have managed it and adapted as per the Human Rights Act in a way that is masterful over the years. So we see no reason why it needs to be changed, and in fact a lot of detriment potentially to the police themselves if the Human Rights Act is replaced by something which is much more difficult to understand or to apply. But thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Thanks, Ali, for that. Just while we've got you, John, I've just a first question to you before we go to the floor, if that's okay, and online. So hot topic from the report, I suppose, the use of firearms, and I'll use the word tasers for ease of use. I suppose as a board, we're urging conversation around that, and it is a conversation starting and keeping it live. So can you talk to the report in terms of what your thinking is around that?
Yes, I mean, I think there is a contradiction between the arming of police officers in Northern Ireland than there is in the Republic, and there is in England and Wales, that I've already said. Now, the question that I would like to think about is, what is the point at which serious consideration can be given to changing the nature of policing in Northern Ireland? It's not just about personal protection weapons, firearms being carried. It's about how far do we need to move before we can, for instance, change the nature of some of the legislation, the Justice and Security Act 2007, for instance, that we already talked about, or the extent to which police officers should be carrying firearms for the majority of the time to protect themselves. That's a tricky situation to be in, and it's obviously very difficult for a society and a police force to move backwards when you've given the police service firearms and you said, we know that you need to be protected. This is a part and parcel of the process by which you can protect yourself. And then to say, okay, well, now we're going to take that away from you. So this is a process of discussion. It's for other people here to ask themselves, when should we have that discussion? Should it be now? Should it be 5 years' time, 10 years' time? What level of security threat should there be to the people of Northern Ireland in general, or to individual police officers, for us to say, okay, well, the situation is safer. It's never going to be safe for police officers. Police officers, unfortunately, are attacked, injured, and sometimes killed in England and Wales and in the Republic, and they don't have guns.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to open up to the floor now if people would like to ask questions. Mike, you go over here.
Thank you, Chair. Mike Nesbitt, I'm a political member of the board. I'm not going to fall out with my friend, Mr. Wadham, but I do want to challenge one thing you said in your presentation, John, with regard to stop and search powers. And you said 99 times out of 100, presumably because there was nothing of an evidential nature recovered, that they were failures. Can you say that without disregarding the deterrent impact of the deployment of stop and search? And how do you measure the deterrent impact? I imagine you would need an incredibly sophisticated intelligence network to be able to make a proper assessment there.
Well, of course, the figures, the 1% figure that I was referring to, didn't include intelligence. So it may well be that the interaction between a police officer and somebody who is up to no good, a dissident Republican or whatever, may actually give that police officer some information that will help the police force to protect people. That's not, and so that may be not measured in that 1%. But the law in this country is you can't use the power for a deterrent effect. That's what the Code of Practice says. That's what the Parliament says. So if police officers in this country are doing that, and they probably are, they're acting unlawfully. Now, you might want to say that that the law should be changed, but since 2007, it is not lawful to use the provisions in that act as a deterrent. Maybe you think that's naive, but that is the law.
Can I make one other? Yeah. I think there's an interesting issue around if it's used in that way as a deterrent. The other issue you've got is what impact does that have on the confidence of policing, on those who are stopped and without a reason. So there's a kind of issue there too that needs to be kind of thought through in operational terms, which is that balance.
I'm not saying it's being used as a deterrent. I'm saying that is, as it were, a byproduct of its application.
I'm thinking of the issue of, for example, of stopping of people from a BAME community in London, and we've seen kind of historically what impact that has in terms of confidence of policing. So we're back, I guess, to the complexity of this, but the issue is got to be looked at in, as well as a legal way, the holistic impact of that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on. Marie, or you want to extend the question? Okay, that's fine, Marie. Yes.
Discussion.
We're coming from Mike with you now, so we can hear you.
And a ramp pair of lungs, mind you. Okay, that's fair. Okay. Yeah, I think, Mike, in relation to the use of stop and search for deterrence, I mean, my learned colleague is quite right that it is not lawful. However, we understand that it is used in that way, and to some extent that it might be an understandable use of it. However, I've put the shoe on the other foot in my discussions with the PSNI, and John has used the word 1%, all but 1% are failures. And the conversation I've had with the PSNI is then if there's another purpose for stop and search, and if there is success in the use of stop and search, can we document that success? Can we actually say what purpose it does serve positively, and can we document that? Because unless there's evidence that it does serve some purpose, and unless we're saying what that purpose is, then we will continue to say that all but 1% is a failure. So I think we need a little bit of transparency here. I think I've spent a great deal of time recently with district teams talking about exactly this. And one of the things that when you look at the authorizations for stop and search, or when you look at when the police officer records why they've stopped and searched somebody, they use this word briefing. Now, briefing can mean a whole lot of things. My husband briefed me before I left the house this morning. I'm suspecting it's not the same thing. And so one of the things I'm pressing the police to do is to be a little bit more specific about why they're stopping and searching people, because we need to drill down into this. If there is a genuine, useful purpose for stop and search that is lawful, then I'm going to be in the police's corner on this. But if it is not lawful and there is no purpose for it, if police officers are stopping people simply because they can, that is not acceptable. So hopefully that, I just wanted to butt in.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Any other questions in the room at the minute? Anybody want to raise? All quiet. Well, I'll go to some questions. Yes, Mark, if you want to reply to that. Yes, that's okay.
Well, there's that, but I think you probably should comment on the firearms question as well. It's been mentioned a few times, and it's a clearly subject of public commentary today. On the routine issuing of police officers in Northern Ireland with weapons, so I was issued with a firearm 28 years ago. I've carried a gun every day of my adult life nearly. And something that I take personally very, very seriously. My understanding of why I have the firearm is that we are routinely and statutorily an unarmed force, but because primarily the terrorist situation in Northern Ireland, the firearm has been issued to me to protect myself from terrorist attack, to protect my colleagues from terrorist attack, and off duty to protect my family, and thereby also protect the public so that I can get on with my job. And if we're under terrorist attack, that we can protect ourselves and the public. And that's my understanding of why we have guns. And there are other people in our society who have guns as well, prison officers and other people who need to do that, because there still is a group of people in Northern Ireland who we know get up every day and their main purpose in life would be to kill one of us. Now, it's a lot rarer than it has been, but we know that still happens. So it's in that context that we are I suppose, a routinely armed force. But we are in statute still an unarmed force, but the Chief Constable then issues them for that purpose. So to the police officers and their families who are listening today, the Chief Constable has no plans to remove personal protection weapons. And I would want to sort of stop that fear if that's out there at the minute. It's perfectly sensible for the policing board to have a discussion with us about the carriage of firearms by police officers, given that the outworking of the use of a firearm is so serious. I think that's perfectly sensible. It's perfectly sensible to be held account for the fact that we issue 7,000 firearms, that we have to train in them, there's costs attached to them, and there's ultimately a life-taking choice attached to the discharge of a firearm. It's perfectly acceptable in a human rights environment and a public answerability and accountability environment. It's absolutely right. And I would hate there to be a situation where in this jurisdiction we couldn't have a discussion about that and be challenged about it, because that's what I think sets us apart as a police service compared to every other armed service in the world. And with respect, sets us apart from the services in England, Wales and Scotland, who admittedly use a specialised firearms model, which we have as well. We have authorised firearms officers, counter-terrorist specialist firearms officers. We have all the same range of tools and fire officers everybody else have, but we also have this bespoke issue. The other issue about firearms is trust. Does this community trust us with our firearms? Do you trust us to carry guns? Do you trust me to have one off duty to protect my family? And because I am a community-based police officer. And if you look at the statistics about the discharge of firearms by the police service in Northern Ireland, they're pretty small. We were talking about a case this morning which was resolved last night, a violent incident where the firearms officers felt that were deployed and someone may have had a gun, and then rather than shoot the person, they used a conductive electricity device. So our officers, because of their human rights training, work extremely hard not to take lives and not to be involved in a process of having to justify the loss of life and coronial processes and all the things that are quite rightly have to occur. So, we need to be convincing everybody that the continued firearms carriage in Northern Ireland is something you can trust your officers with for their own safety. And I think also in the debate as well, there's an important recognition that your cops are under attack at certain times. There was 2 explosive attacks against officers in Derry Londonderry before Christmas. And some of these matters are matters of assuring our officers that we are with them, not refusing to hold them to account, not holding account to the law, but are with them in their discharge of their job. So there may well be, I think we'd all love to get this situation where we had a prolonged, sustained period in Northern Ireland where people weren't planning to kill police officers or prison officers. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And our officers could think differently and breathe differently and tell their kids what they do and not check under their cars and the stuff that they still do. And yeah, let's have a debate then about all the stuff that we need, and we could reduce our cost base and everything else. But at the minute, unfortunately, people still want to kill our police officers. And I think it's just important to say that to those who are listening today about it, and to give some reassurance both to the public and to our serving officers.
Yeah. No, that's very fair, Mark. I'm going to move on to a question submitted earlier, if that's okay, and it's back to yourself again, I think, just to introduce it. So as a board, we welcome the publication of the first Violence Against Women and Girls strategy by the PSNI, and we've seen the increases in domestic abuse and murders, and we're all still shocked at the brutal murder of Natalie McNally and her unborn child. So are the PSNI doing enough to protect women from violence, Mark?
Well, do you know, whilst women are murdered in our society, I think the answer is no. Our job is to protect the community. We can't control the behaviour of everybody in our society. We can't. But we can never relent in our desire to make sure that every year that women in our society are protected from violence and from death. And we had a conversation recently where we said, we know, unfortunately, following statistics, that there are women who are alive at this point in the year in Northern Ireland who may not be alive at the end of the year because they will have died violently at the hands of someone. So I don't want to sit here and say we're doing enough. I'm happy is not the word, sorry.
No.
But we're working very hard. We've published our Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. We have a major investment into our domestic violence policies. We're seeing domestic violence rates increasing, which looks to better reporting. We're trying to improve our outcomes. We're working very hard to improve our preventative strategies. We're working very hard to work with victims to provide a better, more bespoke strategy. We're working doubly hard internally to drive out this sort of issue from inside the organisation. It's well ventilated, and no more even than this week, and the horrors we're seeing in policing. So we've got to keep doing more. We've got to keep being challenged on it, and I'm satisfied that the Chief Constable and the senior executive team, and actually every officer and member of staff in the Police Service Northern Ireland is committed to try and make this better for our society.
Yeah. I suppose an extension from that, before I go to the floor again, if anybody wants to ask a question, I suppose there's inappropriate behaviour of officers, which we know, and in light of the media information that's coming through, and particularly in respect of sexual misconduct and misogyny. So as a board, we spent a lot of time looking at this issue, and you and the Chief Constable this year, and the public can be assured that the actions are being taken to address culture and processes. But in light of the case in London, do we need to do more?
Well, I mean, the case in London, I think, raises a raft of issues for the Metropolitan Police Service, and thereby, I think, for every police service, from who do you recruit, how you recruit them, how you vet them, and then once they're in, how you monitor behaviour, how behaviour is challenged, whether or not it's surfaced up. When it is challenged, are the appropriate levels of taken against it. So I think any police service, any employer who's complacent about that needs to think very hard about it. We're about to get inspected by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire, and this is going to be one of the issues, how well we've been doing. So we look forward with some anxiety, I suppose, trepidation, but also hope that what they're looking at to see where we come up with on this. But again, I mentioned in the previous conversation about trust, about firearms. Well, I mean, you've got to be able to trust your police service and the people in it. Yeah. And if you can't, then that's a significant and serious question for us as a service, and also for us all as society.
Absolutely, Mark. Can I throw it up into the floor? Yes, here. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Kendall Bousquet, Advocacy Officer at Migrants Untitled and a member of the Women's Policy Group. I just wanted to bring it back to the question around firearms, it being the case that research with victims of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland and elsewhere have victims of abuse have related that where the perpetrator was a police officer, personal protection weapons have been used against victims as part of domestic abuse. So I suppose my question to the human rights advisors and the policing board is, to what extent do the rights and the human rights of women and girls kind of corollary to, but outside of the practice of policing, play into a recommendation like the move away from standard issuing of firearms to every officer? And to what extent is this a consideration within the PSNI on this topic?
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think it's a really well made point, and yes, I've seen instances where we have had allegations of sexual offences that have included at least the presence of a firearm, if not the use of a firearm. So, and it plays into the whole issue about the appropriateness of having a firearm, making sure that people are properly trained, and making sure they're removed if there's any risk noticed. So we would like to hope that at the first sign of any indicators of this, that firearms are removed. We're very proactive about removing firearms, although, as I say, not every situation we will know it's occurred. I think the question that you raise about criteria for the use of firearms and carriage of firearms off duty is a very valid one. We have had very difficult incidents over the years of officers using firearms off duty to harm themselves and harm their families. It's horrific. They're usually underlaid by, again, sometimes by mental health and other issues, not always, but can be. So, I mean, I think it's a fair challenge. I think, in its immediacy, it just goes to the point about making sure that the police service is diligent in its issue an audit of our officers, and making sure that where there are any issues raised, that we move quickly to remove that risk.
Thank you, Mark. John and Les?
I mean, I think you put the question exactly right. I mean, that is a factor. And we do a variety of different reports. One of the reports that we'll be doing over the next few months will be about the extent to which the PSNI supports victims, because victims obviously have human rights and the police are there to protect them. So that will be something particularly we want to focus in relation to women and girls. And so your question is incredibly important. I should also say, despite some reports, we also did a report on the human rights of police officers only about 3 months ago, which we published, which didn't get any coverage in the media as far as I know, even though we were exploring with the Federation and other associations the details of exactly what they needed, and there are a number of recommendations that Mark knows about that's pending. So, but also we want to look at women and girls and victims generally. And as you say, I mean, I don't know what the statistics are, maybe Mark knows, the vast number of people who carry guns in this country, in the PSNR, are men. Now, that's not to say that that's a reason why they shouldn't be issued with guns, but it is a question, it is a factor. And obviously, I'm sure we would all want to see a PSNI that had an equal number of people from different communities and an equal number of men and women. But I think that's something I would like, perhaps we could talk about later, about how we factor that in our discussion on the use of, on issues of women and how they're protected.
Yeah, briefly, I mean, I think this interaction is exactly why I would support the recommendation, which is to start a discussion. I mean, Mark has very eloquently set out the reasons why police routinely need to be armed, both in and out of work, and you've highlighted the implications of that in another sphere. My own view, and we obviously I haven't been party to kind of the discussions in the production of this report, but it's clear it is a laudable aim to get to not routinely arming PSNI officers. How long that might take, the criteria that we might have to apply, it seems to me to make sense to start that discussion. It's almost inevitably a long-term discussion. I kind of recognize it's much harder to remove something that you've put in place than it is to, you know, that is quite significant. There are a number of factors. Per head of population, we have far more people holding legal firearms in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in these islands. On the other hand, our crime rates compared to other parts of the UK, we're doing pretty well in terms of, you know, of the level of crime that we face. So there are issues that point in different directions. We haven't got rid of paramilitarism. So this is a difficult, multidimensional, complex discussion, and it's one I think we should have, thinking about the long term. And so you set and hopefully move towards the idea that there might be some parameters within which you hold that discussion, rather than you leave it to a kind of uninformed debate. And that's where I think this report is trying to get to, and I think that's quite significant and actually important, and in the interests of police officers as well as the public at large.
Thank you, Les. And do you want a final comment, or?
Me?
No.
Sorry.
That's okay. You're okay? That's grand.
Can I make a final
Yes, you can, yes.
I mean,
Yes.
Les, I'm with you about the discussion. My worry about such discussions in Northern Ireland is it becomes a very polarised one. And so my strong suggestion, and John knows this because I bore the hell out of him about this all the time, I'm in favour of very specific questions. And the question I would suggest that one will need to focus on in this discussion is, under what conditions can we move to a situation where we no longer routinely arm police officers in Northern Ireland? And under what conditions is a question that invites an enumeration of conditions. And I think that helps because, I mean, you can, for example, I can say, well, I want to lose weight, you know. And unless I have a specific plan, like I'm going to stop buying biscuits or I'm going to register for Slimming World, the day never comes when the weight gets lost. And in the same way, I think quite often when we aspire to grant things like this, unless we have a specific plan and a set of measures and a set of indicators that you know when success or when you can implement your plan, I think that would be my plea here, that we focus on specific conditions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another question. Sorry, I thought you had a hand up earlier. Forgive me. So the question here as well, please. Yes, just come in here. The mic's coming around you.
It's heading to you, Luke.
Thank you.
Hi, Luke Butterly from The Detail. There was just two issues I wanted to bring up from the annual report with Mark. In relation to the arrests of Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey, for the lessons learned report, why has the full report not been shared with the full policing board? And has any officer been disciplined or sanctioned to date over that affair? And just a second question about the community background of those arrested. The annual report said that they were surprised that despite being collected for several years, the figures on arrests had not been shared with the policing board, nor had the policing board, nor had the police investigated these. I understand there has been some more recent work on that, but why were those figures not shared, and why was an investigation into them hadn't taken place?
Okay, so on the Barry McCaffrey, well, we supplied the report to the board. I think I'm just casting my mind back. There was detail in the board or in the report that would have been more specific to certain individuals. I think the decision was taken then that rather than a redacted version to the whole board, that a summary was provided. So that was the decision then. The community background stuff has been evolving for a couple of years. It's now published. We are undertaking work to understand it better, to understand the data sets. It hadn't been published, so we accept that. Certainly when asked, we've given it out. I think what we accept is also that the data set that we haven't been robust enough in recording it. It sits also alongside the very fundamental question about asking for community background information from people, which has been raised with us in a number of fora, including legally, and we discussed this as a service executive board last week. And the strong view is that we should just get on with being more direct now in asking those questions and getting those answers out, and that's what the Chief Constable wants to commit to do, and work is being undertaken. It's starting with the JSA work about being far clearer about the JSA stops, where the community background, asking the questions, hopefully getting to where we can do that, putting in an IT system that is verifiable, that can be properly searched, provided proper data to the board, and we want to commit to do that. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. At the risk of being, I don't believe so, but I'll just have to, I don't believe so. I'll just check, but I don't believe that. At the risk of misquoting myself, but we could certainly, I could certainly get someone to check the detail of that, but I don't believe so.
Okay.
Just on the community background issue, I've been trying to look at Alison to see whether her face changed when you made that announcement. When I first, before I even applied for the job, I had a conversation with Alison about, well, one of the things that, might get done that we've been fighting for a long time might be, and I'm afraid to say I am very impressed with the vast majority of the things that PSNI and their senior officers and all the officers do. But one of the things that I am not persuaded by is the endless excuses that come out of PSNI on why they can't do community background. There is no excuse. I've read the legal advice. The legal advice says there's no problem with just doing it, and it is well, I don't know why. And I'm not asking you to respond to this, Mark, because I don't know where it comes from, but it's very, very depressing. Obviously, good news that we're moving on to the next stage, but I'm afraid, well, I'll shut up now.
Oh. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to a question that's pre-submitted as well here as well. So, and it's with Deputy, I think, for yourself, but across my colleagues as well. The issue of strip search of children and young people is one that has generated questions by the board, which you're aware of. Yeah. As a board, we're giving this issue further scrutiny, but what is your response?
Again, I think whenever this probably emerged out of media reporting again about policing in other parts of the UK, and I think admittedly, I think for chief officers, it was probably an area where we probably weren't personally giving it an awful lot of attention. So it prompted a lot of questions. Quite a bit of exchange with one member of the board in the room who will remain nameless, Mike, but about the accuracy of our data, and we had a very frank exchange around that. So I don't think our data was accurate enough, and I think then the next thing that falls out of it is, I haven't spoken to people about this. The necessity criteria for it, I think, becomes a really difficult point. So there are issues that the police service has to deal with, that other public agencies have to deal with about vulnerable young people. There are times whenever we suspect or fear that a young person may be in possession of drugs, may be in possession of weapons, may be able to harm themselves. I think the question for us is our risk appetite for that too high or too low? And what I mean is that we may be afraid that something might happen to a child or young person and then want to take quick action, but equally we have to be satisfied that we're really satisfied something's going to happen, and there aren't other ways to mitigate that before their mum or dad or guardian or somebody else can certainly come along and be a witness to it. And I do think that quite naturally a lot of our team, particularly in the custody environment, which is difficult, complex, dangerous, and not the best place for young people, we know that. We'll want things to be done quickly to try and preserve a young person's safety. So all that said, it's now firmly on the agenda for the senior team, where we have issued more directions around it, and I think it's one that the board and ourselves will probably have to keep working on across the year.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Colleagues, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, part of the debate, and talking about necessity or purpose, again, it's always struck me in human rights terms, the number of searches without an appropriate adult was quite startling.
Yeah, I think that's a problem.
And that's certainly an issue. But the question of safety, it's always struck me, a number of the searches, strip searches, were in custody. If there's a worry that someone a young child or a young person is in danger of harming him or herself, then frankly there are issues about ensuring that you keep that young person constantly under observation. And therefore, I think there are other ways in which you can protect a young person without resorting to strip searching. If the issue is about finding contraband, then you're back into the proportionality of, is it actually that important to strip search a child or young person to find a mobile phone or whatever? And certainly there, then I can't understand why you wouldn't have an appropriate adult. I do understand the difficulties of protecting a child or young person from self-harm, but there are other ways in which I think you can do that. And I suspect now, I hope that we will have a much more thorough debate in a way that perhaps it's much less likely for strip searching of children and young people to happen, and that the safeguards that are around that are applied assiduously, because one of my worries is it doesn't appear to have been done in the recent past.
Okay, thank you, Les. Colleague over there.
My name is Fergal McFerrin. I'm from the Children's Law Centre. I don't want to labour the point because I think Les has made it quite well already, but the issue itself in terms of strip searching of children and young people, and we've been working closely with Mike and other board members in terms of the questions that have been asked. I think part of the issue is when we started to ask questions, the information we received had to retrospectively been amended, and so it begs the question around what can we trust in terms of what we're now being told about the figures we have only from 2020, because figures before that don't exist. But just to say that we welcome continued scrutiny of the issue from the board, and will continue to support board members where we can on this issue as well.
Thank you very much for that. One last question to the floor. Yes, for yourself, and we'll finish with that before we wrap up. Thank you.
I'm Paul Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Politics in Action, but I'm here as a member of a group called the Stop Attacks Forum. Before I get on to the question I want to ask, I actually want to just, on a personal level, welcome the discussion on whether or not the police should be routinely armed. I think it's an exceptionally important public discussion that, in my view, is overdue, but needs to be held. And I think Marie's question is a brilliant way of framing that potentially. Okay. But as a youth worker, I would like to see young people involved in discussions about that issue, because it's something that really affects how they engage with the police and how they feel about the police when they are routinely armed. About a decade ago, I was in this room with a group of young people at a very similar event, and they questioned the chief constable on paramilitary style assaults. And one of the things they'd uncovered in their own research was that the clearance rate for paramilitary assaults was below 3%. A decade on, that figure hasn't changed. And I have talked to the chief constable about it and senior officers over many years, so I understand from the police their perspective on why that figure is so low. So I'm interested in directing my question to the board and asking, is this something that you think the police need to be scrutinised on a little bit more? I know it was in a human rights report a few years ago. I don't remember the specific wording, but it's an issue that seems to have fallen off the public agenda, and I would strongly encourage the board to take another look at it.
I understand. I'll go down first. I'll go across my colleagues. Or?
Yeah, so well, I won't rehearse some of the explanations you've probably already been given. That said, discussion this morning, even our morning meeting, was about these types of, well, most of them manifest themselves as aggravated burglaries now, people breaking into people's homes, violating their homes and then assaulting them. I mean, our continual problem is identification and evidence to support the people who did it, and the fear that's instilled in the victims once it's happened. And that remains both a policing problem and a societal problem. So I think you are wise and sensible to keep it on the agenda, because the harm is quite considerable. People are suffering quite severe injuries, being forced out of their communities, and having to live under threat. So, I mean, I'll pass them by board colleagues, but yeah.
Okay, that's great. Colleagues, does anybody want to comment on this?
I can't comment on what the policing board has done in the kind of recent past, but it's clearly a human rights issue. I mean, I talked earlier about inhuman and degrading treatment and Article 3 and a minimum severity that you have to reach that. Well, I'm pretty sure that punishment, beatings of whatever kind, reach that minimum threshold, raise human rights issues. So it's a human rights issue. What and, whether the board should do more is one I'll happily take away in terms of, thinking about what's a fairly significant list of issues that the board faces.
Okay. I mean, the board did produce a report on PCTF work and made recommendations on this issue, and that is on the board agenda. But obviously, there's also a DOJ team that works to tackle paramilitarism in society, and it's not just a policing response. I'd have to maybe round up with that point, if that's okay. Folks, I'm going to round up the conversation tonight, or today. Thank you. So I'm going to close the event. We had 22 people online as well, which is really, really good. I think the discussion has been fairly rounded and very, very welcome from everybody. So I just want to thank you all for joining the webinar today. John, for your expert advice and guidance to us throughout the year, to Les Allenby and Mark Hamilton for your contributions today. And also those who submitted questions and asked questions in the room as well. So if you weren't able to get your question, we will get answers to you in terms of further clarity, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So we're keen to engage and have feedback on how we do our work, and if you have any comments or suggestions for improvement, please let us know. And once again, thank you for joining us today, and the footage will be published for our YouTube later today. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you, Chair.